In 650 BC, Rome was not the grand empire we often imagine. It was a much simpler place. Think of a cluster of small villages. These villages were built on hills near the Tiber River. Life was basic. People worked hard every day. They were mostly farmers and shepherds. The idea of conquering the world was far away. Rome was just one of many small settlements in the region of Latium. It was not particularly special at this time. Other towns in Italy were larger or more powerful. Rome's story starts very humbly. The people who lived in these early Roman villages were known as Latins. They spoke an early form of Latin. Their lives were tied to the land. They grew crops like wheat and barley. They raised animals such as sheep, goats, and pigs. There were no magnificent temples or giant arenas yet. Instead, simple huts dotted the landscape. These homes were made from wood, mud, and straw. It was a rustic existence. Their world was small, focused on survival and community. There were practical people making do with what they had. Around Rome, the Italian peninsula was a busy place. To the north lived the Etruscans. They had a more advanced civilization at this time. They built larger cities and had rich art. To the south, Greek colonists had established cities. These Greek cities brought Greek culture and trade to Italy. Rome was caught between these influences. It learned from both, but it was still developing its own identity. It was a small player in a land of older, more established cultures. Rome had a long journey ahead to become a major power. Later, Romans told stories about their city's founding. They spoke of Romulus and Remus, twin brothers raised by a wolf. These are exciting tales. However, the real story is likely less dramatic. Archaeologists find evidence of small settlements on the hills. These settlements slowly grew. They gradually joined together. This process happened over many years. It was not the work of one heroic founder. It was the slow effort of many people. These early people laid the groundwork for the city that would one day rule an empire. Their forgotten efforts were the true beginning. Rome is famous for its 7 hills. These are the Palatine, Capitoline, Aventine, Caelian, Esquiline, Viminal, and Quirinal hills. In 650 BC, these hills were not covered in marble temples. They were modest rises in the landscape. Some were steeper than others. They provided natural defenses for the small villages. People felt safer living on these higher points. The hills were close together. This allowed the separate villages to eventually connect. The valleys between them were often marshy. This geography shaped how Rome grew. The location of these hills was very important. It was a strategic choice, even if early settlers did not fully realize it. The hills made it easier to defend against attacks from rival tribes. The Tiber River flowed nearby. This river was a vital resource. It provided fresh water for drinking and farming. It also offered a route to the sea, which was about 15 miles away. This allowed for trade. Yet Rome was far enough inland to be protected from sea raids by pirates. This combination of defense and access was a key advantage. The valleys between Rome's hills presented challenges. These low-lying areas were often wet and swampy. The most famous valley, which later became the Roman Forum, was originally a marshy burial ground. It was not suitable for building or large gatherings at first. To make these areas usable, they needed to be drained. This was a big task for the early Romans. Over time, they learned how to manage the water. They built channels and drains. This work transformed the landscape. It allowed the city to grow and create central public spaces. The land around Rome also offered valuable resources. The soil in the plains near the river was fertile. This was good for growing crops to feed the growing population. There were forests nearby. These provided timber for building homes and fuel for fires. Stone, like tufa, could be quarried locally for foundations and later for more permanent structures. These natural gifts supported the early community. They helped Rome survive and eventually thrive. The very land Rome was built on played a crucial part in its story from the earliest days. Life for an early Roman around 650 BC was very basic. Their homes were not like the grand villas we see in movies. Most people lived in small, circular or rectangular huts. These huts were typically made from simple materials. The walls were constructed using a technique called wattle and daub. This involved weaving branches or reeds together. Then a mixture of mud, clay and straw was plastered over the woven frame. The roofs were usually thatched with straw or dried reeds. These homes had earthen floors and probably only one room for all activities. What did early Romans wear? Their clothing was also simple and practical. Most garments were made from wool, which came from their sheep. Men and women likely wore a basic, sleeveless tunic. This was a shirt-like garment that reached the knees or ankles. If it was cold, they might add a heavier cloak, also made of wool. Leather from animal hides could be used for belts, simple shoes, or protective gear. There was not much difference in clothing between the rich and the poor in these very early times. Fashion was not a major concern. Utility was key. Food in archaic Rome was straightforward and based on agriculture. The main part of their diet was probably a porridge made from grains. Emmer, wheat and barley were common. They called this pulse. They also ate vegetables grown in small gardens such as beans, lentils and cabbages. Fruits like figs and apples were available seasonally. Olives were important, providing oil for cooking and light. Meat was not eaten every day. It was more of a luxury, perhaps enjoyed during festivals or special occasions. They drank water, milk, and a simple form of wine. Family was the center of Roman life. The head of the family was the paterfamilias, the oldest living male ancestor. He had great authority over his household. This included his wife, children, grandchildren, and any slaves the family might own. Extended families often lived together or very close by. Women's roles were primarily focused on managing the household. They would prepare food, make clothing, and raise the children. Life was hard, and everyone in the family had to contribute to survive. Children learned skills from their parents from a young age. During the period from 650 to 550 BC, Rome was traditionally ruled by kings. This is known as the Roman monarchy. Roman tradition tells us there were 7 kings in total, starting with the legendary Romulus. However, it is important to remember that much of this early history was written down much later. The kingship in early Rome was not like the absolute monarchies of later times. The king was usually chosen or acclaimed, perhaps by an assembly of the people or with the approval of the leading elders. His power was significant, but had limits. The Roman king had several important duties. He was the primary military commander. He led the Roman warriors in battle against neighboring tribes. He was also the chief priest of the city. This meant he was responsible for performing important religious ceremonies. These rituals were believed to ensure the favor of the gods for Rome. The king also acted as a judge. He would settle disputes between citizens and enforce the community's laws and customs. He was the public face of Rome, representing the community in its dealings with others. The king did not rule alone. He was advised by a council of elders called the Senate. The word Senate comes from the Latin word senex, meaning old man. These senators were usually the heads of the most important and wealthy families, known as patra or fathers. In these early days, the Senate did not make laws. However, their advice, called the Senatus Consultum, carried great weight. A wise king would listen carefully to his senators. Over time, the Senate's influence and power grew steadily, becoming a cornerstone of Roman governance. Besides the king and the Senate, there was also an early form of popular assembly. This was called the Comitia Curiata. The Roman people were organized into 30 groups called curia. These were likely based on kinship or local districts. This assembly would meet to witness important public acts. For example, they might formally approve a new king. They would also witness wills and adoptions. While not a democratic body in the modern sense, it gave the citizens some role in public life. It showed that even under kings, the community had a voice. The early Romans were a deeply religious people. They believed in many gods and spirits. These supernatural forces, called noumena, were thought to control every aspect of life and nature. There were spirits of the forests, rivers and fields. Very important were the household gods. The Lares protected the family and its home. The Penetes guarded the family's food supply. Each family would have a small shrine in their home. They made daily offerings to these personal deities. This, ensured protection and good fortune for the household. Among the major gods, Jupiter was supreme. He was the god of the sky, thunder and lightning. He was seen as the protector of Rome. Mars was another crucial god. Originally, he might have been an agricultural deity protecting crops and livestock. However, he increasingly became the god of war, a vital role for a growing city. Juno was the wife of Jupiter. She was the goddess of women, marriage, and childbirth. Vesta was the goddess of the hearth, the sacred fire of the home and the city. Early temples to these gods were simple, perhaps just open-air altars or small wooden shrines. Religious duties were taken very seriously. The king himself was the chief priest. There were also specialized groups of priests. The pontiffs, led by the Pontifex Maximus, oversaw the state religion and the calendar. They ensured rituals were performed correctly. Augurs were priests who interpreted the will of the gods by observing the flight of birds or other natural signs called auspices. Haruspexes specialized in examining the entrails of sacrificed animals for omens. Performing rituals exactly right was essential. Any mistake could anger the gods and bring misfortune to Rome. Public religious festivals were a key part of Roman life. Many of these were tied to the agricultural year. They were designed to ensure good harvests and the fertility of the land and people. For example, the Lupercalia, held in February, was a purification and fertility rite. Other festivals honored specific gods. These public ceremonies helped to unite the community. They reinforced shared beliefs and values. They sought to maintain the Pax Deorum, or peace of the gods. This was a state of harmony between humans and the divine, essential for Rome's safety and prosperity. Burials were common in this early period, with bodies often placed in simple graves. Between 650 BC and 550 BC, Rome began to change from a collection of separate villages into a more unified city. The population was growing and, this might have been due to natural increase. It was also likely that people from the surrounding countryside or other Latin towns moved to Rome. They might have been attracted by the safety of the hills or new opportunities. As more people lived closer together, the settlements on the Palatine, Capitoline, and other hills started to merge, creating a larger, more cohesive community. This growing population needed more land and resources, so early Rome started to expand its influence into the surrounding territory. This often meant conflict with its neighbors, which were usually other Latin tribes or nearby Sabine communities. These early wars were small-scale affairs. They were not about conquering vast territories. Instead, they were fought for control of farmland, grazing pastures, or important river crossings. Each small victory allowed Rome to secure more resources and also increased its reputation among the other towns in Latium. A major step in Rome's urban development was the draining of the marshy valley that would become the Forum Romanum. Traditionally, this work began in this period. This area, located between the Palatine and Capitoline hills, was vital. By draining it, the Romans created a dry central space that could be used for markets, public meetings, and religious ceremonies. It became the heart of the city. This transformation was a sign that Rome was becoming a more organized and ambitious settlement. It was really a physical manifestation of its growing unity. During this century, Rome also came under increasing influence from its more developed neighbors, especially the Etruscans. The Etruscans from Etruria to the north of Rome had a sophisticated culture. They were skilled builders, artists, and traders. Romans began to adopt some Etruscan ideas, including architectural styles such as the use of terracotta roof tiles. Religious practices like divination were also influenced by the Etruscans. Even the Roman alphabet was adapted from the Greek alphabet, likely through Etruscan intermediaries. This cultural exchange helped to modernize early Rome. One of the most significant achievements of this early period was the development of the Forum Romanum. What was once a swampy burial ground between the hills began its transformation into the city's civic heart. This was not a quick process. It involved draining the land and then gradually paving parts of it. The Forum became the main public square, where people gathered to trade goods at the market and where political discussions took place. Important religious shrines were also located there. This central space was crucial for developing a shared Roman identity. Alongside the development of the Forum, early Romans began to build more permanent religious structures. While many early shrines were simple open-air altars, this period saw the construction of the first true temples. Tradition tells us that a temple to Vesta, goddess of the hearth, was established in the Forum. This temple housed the sacred flame of Rome. A temple to Janus, the two-faced god of beginnings and endings, may also date to this era. These early temples were likely built of wood and mud brick. They were not as grand as later marble structures, but they signified a growing communal investment in religion. A vital piece of infrastructure, the Cloaca Maxima, or Greatest Drain, is said to have been started during this time. This was a large covered sewer system, and its primary purpose was to drain the marshy lowlands, especially the Forum area. It carried excess water and waste away from the city centre and into the Tiber River. Constructing the Cloaca Maxima was a remarkable engineering achievement for its time. It required considerable planning and labour. It made the city much more habitable and healthier, and it also allowed for further development of the Forum and surrounding areas. While the famous Servian Wall around Rome was built later, it's possible that some earlier, simpler defensive structures were erected during this period. As Rome grew in size and wealth, it would have become a more attractive target for raids. Early fortifications might have included earthen ramparts or wooden palisades around the most important settlements like the Palatine Hill. These defences would have been much less substantial than later stone walls, but they would have provided a measure of security for the inhabitants. Protecting the growing community was a constant concern for early Roman leaders. This century, from 650 to 550 BC, was a time of significant change, traditionally associated with several of Rome's kings. Ancus Marcius is said to have reigned from 642 to 617 BC. According to later Roman historians, he expanded Roman territory towards the sea and is credited with founding the port of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber River. This would have been a major step for Roman trade. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, or Tarquin the Elder, traditionally reigned from 616 to 579 BC. He is often described as an Etruscan who came to Rome and became king, and he is associated with starting large public building projects. The reign of Tarquinius Priscus, if historical, marks a period of particularly strong Etruscan influence on Rome. His very name suggests an Etruscan origin. Under his supposed leadership, Rome began to look more like an Etruscan city. He's credited with laying out the Circus Maximus, a large venue for chariot races, and is also said to have begun work on the great temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill. Etruscan artisans and engineers may have been brought to Rome, and this period saw advances in building techniques and a more sophisticated urban plan. Socially, Rome was also evolving. As the city grew, society likely became more complex. The distinction between wealthy landowning families and poorer commoners probably became more pronounced. The leading families, who later became known as patricians, would have dominated political and religious life. A class of artisans and traders was also emerging as Rome became more of a commercial centre. We do not have detailed records from this time, but the foundations of later Roman social structure were likely being laid during these formative years. By 550 BC, Rome's position in Latium was strengthening. It was no longer just one small village among many. It was becoming a significant regional power. Its growing population, organized government, and developing infrastructure gave it advantages over its neighbors. While it did not yet dominate Latium, Rome was increasingly able to project its power. It engaged in alliances and conflicts with other Latin cities. This century was crucial in setting Rome on a path from a minor settlement to a leading city-state in central Italy. The groundwork for future expansion was firmly in place. By the middle of the 6th century BC, around 550 BC, Rome was a very different place than it had been 100 years earlier. It had transformed from a loose collection of hilltop villages into a recognizable city-state. It had a defined urban center in the Forum, and it had significant public buildings, including temples and drains. Its population had grown considerably. It possessed an organized system of government under its kings, advised by the Senate. Its people shared common religious beliefs and practices. Rome was now a tangible entity with a growing sense of its own identity. The foundations laid during this crucial century were incredibly important for Rome's future. Its strategic location on the Tiber, with access to the sea yet defensible, proved to be a lasting advantage. The early Romans showed an ability to organize themselves for communal projects like draining the Forum. They developed political institutions such as the kingship and the Senate, which, though they would change, provided a framework for governance. Critically, Rome also showed an early capacity to absorb outsiders and incorporate elements from other cultures, like the Etruscans. This openness would be a key to its later success. The experiences of this period prepared Rome for the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. The early small-scale conflicts with neighboring tribes taught the Romans about warfare and diplomacy. They learned how to organize their fighting men and how to secure new territories. The development of the Forum as a central meeting place fostered a sense of civic community. The beginnings of infrastructure, like the Cloaca Maxima, made the city more livable and allowed for further growth. These early steps, though seemingly modest, were essential building blocks for what was to come. Rome was learning how to be a city. In 550 BC, no one could have predicted that Rome would one day rule a vast empire stretching across the Mediterranean world. It was still just one of many city-states in Italy. However, the Rome of this era already possessed some of the key characteristics that would fuel its rise. It had ambition. It had a practical, determined population. It had institutions that could adapt and evolve. The period between 650 and 550 BC was when the DNA of Rome was truly formed. The seeds of its future greatness were sown in these early, often overlooked years of its long and remarkable history.